This has been my lifetime study, of course, because I was nurtured to believe that faith was about public truth, about exploring public truth. And my life in the church, which has been for 45 years formally now, has disappointed me because I've largely found that the church talks very strongly about personal care and support and encouragement, but really doesn't look at the structures that are now dominating our society. And at the root of all that lies the problem that we will not face that money making money, which in all the great faith traditions has been forbidden, is now neglected by the Christian church, and indeed by other faiths, except the Muslims, who really still have a deep concern that we should have a balanced economy where everyone shares risk and reward and there is no exploitation. And their argument, and mine, is that interest or usury or riba, whichever you call it, is that exploitative root in the system that we have to deal with. And that's why I served in this church, because it has windows about the world of work. It has pictures of people at their work. And subsequently, while I was serving here for 30 years, we put in the lower windows, which depict the structures within which those people work, because we were exploring how the structure itself becomes more powerful than any individual's desire to change.
So you say capital, with capital you can gain more money than with work?
Yes. I think there are important works that study the fact that since way back 4,000 years ago, once property laws allowed people to accumulate property beyond that which was valuable for common good, then a cash nexus grew up with that property and money started to make money. People started to lend money and expect more than the money to be returned. Interest was introduced. And that started to destabilize. And over the centuries it's gone on. At certain points in history it's been aggravated, so the speed of division has increased. And in the last 30 or 40 years, since money went off the gold standard, and with the advent of the great institutions of Bretton Woods, from that point on, the widening of the gap has been accelerated and is now in quite frightening proportions. If you read the newspapers just of the last 3 weeks, you'd find a massive boom and then huge drops and talk about the collapse of the world monetary system. We're in a very serious state, and we've been neglecting this area of corporate power and force, and the way in which, against people's intention, an evil seems to enter into institutions, and they protect their vested interests, and a cost is paid by society at large, and we now realize by the sustainability of the planet itself in terms of human life.
So you mentioned just some origin causes of this actual situation. Why does not anybody speak about this origin causes of this problem?
I think partly because the faults in the system developed over such a long period of time, or the exaggeration of those faults. The fault was always there, is my argument. Once usury was allowed, a thing forbidden in all ancient wisdom, from Aristotle through all the great faiths. So it's always been there, but it's been growing so slowly until recently that people failed to notice that. Meanwhile, the wonderful material wealth that the use of capital, and I'm not talking here of finance capital, but of capital, and the realization that capital had a productive capacity different from labor. They're closely related, of course, but with modern technology, capital has an enormous creative power with very little dependence on labor, relatively. And so that exaggerated situation is now dawning on people, and it's very, very late, because the institutions that uphold it are of immense power. And most people won't discuss this because they fear for their pensions, or they say, I'm not an economist. And I, as a clergyman, say, if you have any faith from any tradition and you care about the world and its people, you must be concerned with economy. It means housekeeping. And if we all say we're not economists, I say we are all amateur economists. We all ought to know what is the intrinsic value of a good economy, a balanced, stable, inclusive economy. And then we might ask our innocent, ignorant questions of the so-called experts in economics who play along with this terrible deceit, not an intended deceit, but nonetheless a profound deceit. People are deceived into thinking that we have the best of all possible systems. And we may, in fact, now have the worst of all possible systems because it's so destructive of planet and of people.
But if you see in politics, there are different layers or different, well, the left wing and the right wing there have a discussion since centuries now about the same little variants
Yes.
of things. So why is it that people blame rather the rich or somebody from the left wing or somewhere else than a structure? Why is
Well, it's really because of the rigidity of those divisions that we've generated in party politics, adversarial politics. It's due to that rigidity, I think, that makes it very difficult for people to grasp a global understanding of what we're all about in humanity as a whole, and the damage we're doing through a loss of an understanding of stewardship, a loss of understanding what the real rhythms of nature are. We're exploiting all those things. And part of the difficulty in modern communication about how to change the situation is we want to say, lay aside adversarial politics. Look at that inclusive understanding that makes us all global citizens. That doesn't take away other local loyalties to family and nation and so on. But there must be an overarching or an undergirding loyalty to our common humanity on a limited earth. I mean, it's immensely abundant if we used it wisely, but it's extremely limited if we all become consumerists and believe that the only happiness lies in increased material growth. And the distress about that, I think, is reflected in an enormously wide searching for new spirituality. My argument is, beware that we don't search for spirituality outside our materiality, because spirit and matter are the same thing, viewed differently. And we have to get the spiritual wholeness into the material practices and the material desires and consumption and so on of our own lives. And people find it very difficult to realize that real life is not just personal at the intimate, person-to-person, small community, cell-like level. It's also caught up in very large, powerful institutions, and it's also part of the sustainability of the biosphere itself. So I argue that we have to develop a faith that moves constantly between what I call the intimate, small, face-to-face sort of meetings, whether it's family or small group or whatever, and the corporate, which becomes very complex the moment you move beyond 10, 12, 20 people. The complexity just accelerates enormously. And at the same time, to understand that we have an ecological identity. I sometimes say we live in a society where we are developing all the time a psyche the size of the self, when we really should be developing a psyche the size of the universe, and then humbly discovering ourselves in it. If we did that, I think we'd begin to understand that if you stand back and take a look at humanity on Earth, you would realize that we've got our structures very wrong indeed. And I pin those down to saying laws governing property, law governing corporate power, and laws governing the way money is presently created and distributed into society. Those three areas have to have fundamental structural change if we are to have an inclusive justice that works for everybody and protects the earth, to use Margaret Kennedy's beautiful phrase.
The structure we all may be grabbing for, might this be in these days maybe some kind of a replacement of the religious faith, we use that?
Yes. I think the replacement of religious faith is an extremely important issue. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Root of All Evil, ? And she's a financial journalist and a mother. And the very first chapter of her book describes how in the life of children in a modern nurturing situation, whatever kind of family it is, it's possible to spot how quickly children become confused between whatever they're being taught about a living, dynamic God and a purposeful life on earth, and money as a God. And she traces out with anecdotal evidence how quickly children really begin to understand that the God of our modern society, in this country, she writes, is money. And so I think that's a problem. My dilemma with the life of the church is that the preservation of its institutional life, of its magnificent buildings, of the cost of its committees and so on, dominates most conversations. And they don't realize that they are thinking much more about institutional preservation and membership and drawing in people to get their money for the good cause of keeping a building going or enabling a ministry to individuals to go out. And all those things predominate. And a discussion about the corporate level of our witness, the challenge to structures that we've unconsciously allowed to control our lives, that's very, very difficult to raise indeed. I have to say that in my dealings with Muslims, even serious groups of Muslim businessmen, the feeling that everyone is talking as though they lived in submission to God, they live within the context of something that is about the whole of life, makes dialogue with them, even though a lot of it is discussing the drift of Muslim life into some of the worst elements of Western life. Nonetheless, you can have that confidence and that conversation. Over my 44 years as industrial chaplain, I've met many business groups of Christians mainly, or Christian association if they're not particularly of the church. And that kind of conversation is not possible because it shows that we've split the material and the spiritual life. And for so many people in Western Christianity, I think I dare say, there is that dualistic element that has come into our view. And religious life is something private and local and community-based. And business, well, that's something different. So my conviction that spirit and matter are the same thing, seen in a different light, is quite hard to communicate because people want me to talk a limited institutional religious language, whereas I want to talk people's economic language and probe it and listen, because a lot of it is outside my comprehension. But I want to enter into it and question it innocently and ignorantly so that I can reflect on their responses and say, is there corporate contribution, something that works for everyone and protects the earth? If you can't say that, then you have to start saying what vested interests are at work in this institution that actually unconsciously are a conspiracy against the general public. And of course, one element of this is that our society is immensely competitive. And I think all the great faiths at their heart say that faith is about life that is cooperative, not competitive. And so this is another area which we really have to re-examine our faith, not by constantly quoting scripture, but by grasping the main impulse of inclusive justice for all that lies behind the great faiths, and then work that out in contemporary modern terms. I don't use quotations from scripture very much. I say to people, I am a Christian, assume that I'm deeply versed in those, and then let's explore in the contemporary situation where you're working, what you're thinking about, over a meal, wherever it is, let's apply that whole inclusive faith to what we're actually doing and the way we're behaving and the way we're consuming and the way we're making assumptions about our standard of living that don't take account of the standard of livings of other people just down the road or in another land or wherever it is.
Speaking about Muslims, in Islam, interest is forbidden. But how do they keep the money in the market? What's their way to keep the money?
Well, usury, of course, is different than profit. And in good business, a profit is perfectly acceptable. In good trading, and the basis of good trading is, well, there are a number of them, but the main one is that there should always be, in any trading transaction, a sharing of risk and reward. And that any contract is upheld. There should be nothing in small print. It should all be utterly transparent. And even on those two, without a number of others that are basic to them, and I think basic to the other faiths, but not spelled out in the way the Muslims do so clearly. Once you've got those in your mind and a view that all life is a submission to God, or if you're not of a religious disposition, everything is subject to the energies and the balances of this amazing biosphere in which we live and of which we are part. And we must conform to its natural rhythms, not feel that we can control and manipulate creation. We can do with skill and art and so on creative things within that biosphere's natural balances that make things good, the wonderful benefits of material life. The problem is when you start to think that accumulation, which interest, usury, riba, allows, to take over, and you justify your richness without regard to the expense that others pay that you might be rich. And today, of course, when the rapidity of change in Brazil, in India, in China, means that the global quest for a standard of living that is not possible on this planet for everyone on the planet. People say, with some statistical evidence, that if everyone was to rise to the British standard of living, we'd need 3 planets. If it was to the American standard of living, we'd need 5 planets. I mean, that's a light little way of saying something very, very serious, that the future is not in increased consumerism on all fronts. It's about a delicate way of living with the advantages of a material, modern, technologically supported society, but at a very simple level, simple at a high quality of life, which is much less accumulative and much less consumerist. Now, the only way this would be possible would be to restore a balanced economy where usury was taken out, because that's the exploitative cancer that we've tacked on to the way we trade with one another, the way we exchange, and that has grown now to very serious proportions. And many people are beginning to doubt that we can cure that cancer. And so they're looking at an alternative life for a few people who bother to prepare for it, while the mass of humankind finds that the earth will no longer sustain them. I don't go with that. I don't go with some privileged preparation for a few to survive. I want to see a structural change in those great things of corporate law, property law, and money law that will allow us to restore a sustainable, high quality, low consumption, richly mutual and cooperative society. And all that is about faith. It's about living faith, that if there's a God, then that God is offering unconditional love, incredible abundance, but to be shared by everyone justly.
Staying with the Islam, if a bank does not give loans, but keep also with the risk, but also with profit, isn't this making the banks much more powerful than if they just give interest loans?
There are major questions that the astute Muslims are themselves asking about the way in which the huge surge in Islamic banking all around the world in the last 10 years is going. And there is a fear that because of the way that each corporate activity must have Sharia compliance, and the corporations are very often, banks included, hiring Sharia advisors and paying them. And there is no single interpretation of Sharia law. So the temptation to draw in people who will conform to something that looks Islamic but in fact has hidden interest or its equivalent is eroding a lot of Islamic finance. And that's recognized in Islamic circles, and great debate is about it. It's very interesting that I, as a Christian, with a colleague of mine and others who meet weekly to discuss these matters, are helping Muslim scholars and bankers who are prepared to listen to understand that there is a way to pursue the Islamic, and I say other faith, and all good faith insights about a system free of interest. We're actually designing that, and the teaching text that has been prepared, soon to be published, will be taught in 4 universities this year and probably in 10 next year, and the feeling is it will spread among those universities where Islamic finance is taught. What we would hope is that it will be called universal finance and not Islamic. They are retaining the insight, but it's an insight that the whole of humanity could own. And I think all the great faiths in the past have owned, but have neglected.
Okay, let's come back to the Christian world. Do you know any actual statement from official church person, Catholic or Protestant?
Yes, I mean, the present Pope has recently declared, in an aside, in a huge address, that usury is wrong, that it's a vicious, usurious, that is, it's using other people, it's exploitative. Now, that's tucked away, but it's there. And many years ago, long before he was Pope, he made a statement of great strength on that. And the last Pope made a statement. Now, they didn't make the statement every week. They make it, and then it gets lost, because the reality is that the institutional truth, the keeping of the great Catholic Church going, or the great Anglican Church going, or even the local church going, that takes over from serious daily appraisal of a faith that is for everyone and for all of life. And how does that apply in our daily behavior, in the corporate activities we partake in? That debate doesn't take place very often very seriously, because all the maintenance of institutional life predominates. And now that I'm without charge, I don't use the word retirement, I'm retreaded, and I move around a lot of churches, is my great dismay that almost all the conversations are about institutional preservation in one way or another. They are not about exploring how faith fits this extraordinarily wonderful but deeply, deeply endangered modern society that we have in the West. And because it's so attractive, there is so much that's wonderful about it, all the nations of the world are tending to seek after it without understanding that it's a false quest, because it's a consumptive approach to well-being, not a mutual, community-based, nurturing community, where with modern technology you can have a very wonderful but a very simple life.
In your book, 7 Steps to Justice, you propose capital ownership for everybody. How could that work out in practice?
Yes, I think it's arguable that behind every great faith and behind common sense, if you care about the dignity of all people, there should be the idea that the first call on a nation's accumulated wealth should be a basic income for all citizens. In our complex modern society, not only a basic income that every citizen would have of right, which would save enormous costs, for instance, and the way we manage the present welfare society by pleading for your bit of help when you're desperate, no one would be desperate because they'd all have a minimal guaranteed income. That ought to be right up front in every faith and its deliberations. But in addition to that, in a modern society, in order to have purchasing power, people do need to have a foothold in the capital that is now such a major source of assets and wealth. And part of the difficulty when you keep going back to right and left arguments and socialism and Marxism and so on, rather than to looking afresh at the ecological community of which we are all part and the non-adversarial, cooperative way of living that requires of us, then you need to have some purchasing power. And so the book that we wrestle with, in the book called 7 Steps, we wrestle with this idea called in America binary economics, that when interest-free money is loaned into new creativity, it should be on the agreement that the product of that creativity is gradually, evenly dispersed into wider ownership. So it's a great advance on employee share ownership. It's talking about a graduated growth into universal share ownership. And that is a profoundly theological and faithful insight, that the abundance of God is to be owned in a sense by all, or maybe not even owned, shared and stewarded. So stewardship might mean temporary ownership while you take care for the common good of certain things, but not in permanent accumulative ownership. That idea we've got to erode. And to do so, we've got to tackle corporate power. We've got to talk about the legal systems that perpetuate these great institutional forces that are now rapidly destroying us.
But what I don't understand, capital ownership means also an ongoing, similar profit-like interest. So the problem with the growth, you can't beat with it.
Yes. This becomes a bit technical, of course, and quite difficult to get into, but it is important to realize that we're not going to go from the present situation to a wonderful, balanced, cooperative society. We've got to work with the existing system and to try and increase the rapidity with which we move to new awareness, what some people call a new paradigm. I would say a consciousness that we're all dependent on our ecological identity, our inseparable, interdependent part in one great biosphere, what some people call Gaia, or the sacredness of all life and its interdependence. And so, yes, our book is deliberately an attempt to take steps to recognize the existing system, but to gradually interpose a different way of distributing. I personally, out of my faith, would like to say redistribution is out, pre-distribution is in. But that's utopian. I want it to be visionary, but that we move to it through steps that are likely to be understood, we hope, in the relatively short term, and acted on with increasing rapidity as we realize that unless we make these changes, then all the great descriptions coming in from all over the place now about passing tipping points, if we're to make any recovery, then we have to learn humbly, quickly, effect changes within the existing system, but eventually lead people to a fundamentally different system. And it would be based on an interest-free, limited property ownership, and a requirement in corporate law for genuine recognitions of the needs of the whole human community and of the planet itself. And that's not going to come about rapidly. At the moment, corporate law is under scrutiny in our parliament in an 800-clause document, a massive thing, and the people who are able to read and understand it say the changes represented in it are minuscule. It doesn't take away the main purpose of corporate bodies being shareholder value, which is something that has its roots, money making money at other people's expense. And that is unacceptable in all great faiths, and I think any faith about common sense in how humans live together on a limited planet.